Hello, I am here with Brett Danton. He is director, DP, technologist, I think is what
Well,
we're
it
going
seems
to
to
call
be,
you
yes,
now.
with all the way the technology is going, that's what I'm definitely wearing that hat lately.
Okay, well, tell us a little bit about that. I know you've been doing a lot of work with the sort of XR studio and this whole buzzword of XR. Give us a little bit of...
I mean, XR, as you said, it is the buzzword, but I mean, it really got expedited during the pandemic. You know, people couldn't go off on locations, couldn't go, you couldn't even, sort of set foot. So people had to work in, bubbles. And so an XR stage is basically, it's a giant TV, but it has the ability to, with the computer technology, the image behind moves and shows you the parallax. So, when you're walking along and you see a lamppost go behind a wall, that's what happens. But when you move the camera, it all links to the camera. So then as you adjust the focus, it also adjusts the focus on the screens. So, it's opened up a whole new world of, shooting. I think everybody's familiar with The Mandalorian. That was the first thing that they did it. And one of the big challenges was that, there was the big helmet with all the reflections. So shooting inside an XR stage, all the reflections were correct because the image wrapped around. And that's now progressed a lot further where, we're shooting on XR stage. I've been using some lights called quasar lights, and there are other lights will do them. But that is actually linked to the image that uses a protocol so that the engine that's producing the image can actually send out the information to the lighting and adjust the lighting in real time. So as you pan the camera around, not only does the image behind move and the parallax is correct, but also the lights change. So all of a sudden now what we've got is we've got this world that we can basically take an outside world and bring it into an inside world and shoot inside a studio.
So this is it's kind of like green screen on steroids.
It's green screen on steroids. I mean, the actors love it because they're seeing the real thing. Obviously there's a whole lot of things, we've touched upon, you look at the environmental impact of a big crew turning up and, a lot of sites now don't want to have that. I was in Italy recently and there was a very sensitive site that they had a big film shoot at that's a World Heritage and the whole site caught on fire. So, they're never going to have a film shoot back again. So a lot of these places we can't go in. So what you can do now is you can recreate these back inside a studio. I'm used to getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning and shooting sunrise. Then you're supposed to go back to the hotel and sleep at night. Obviously you can't go back to, we never can because the body clock's wrong. And then you get back up and you work till 10 at night because you shoot the sunset. Only if you've got things like overtime and all of that and equipment to move. We can all do that inside the one environment now. We turn up at 8 and we finish at 6 and we've done sunrise, sunset, middle of the day. You can do effects like rain, fog in there, all sorts of stuff. So open up a whole new way of shooting.
Interesting. And so how does this link in with some of the Canon cameras that you're using? How do they kind of work together?
So, I mean, I did a big thing, we did a big thing with Bastille recently, and we shot them against an XR stage. We took that to a slightly even further level where we actually streamed in fans from around the world live. They appeared on the screen and the band could actually interact with those fans live. And the fans sitting at home were wearing Oculus Quests and they could actually see the band and they had a full view of the band playing and this interaction was amazing. But on that job I chose C500 Mark IIs. Main reason I chose those was that, the full frame sensor because obviously you are still dealing with something that's got a dot on it. So you can end up with things like moire pattern. Obviously you've got to slightly, getting the color science correct on the screen is quite hard. So you want to extract as much out of the image as you can. So the 500 for me, I found perfect. We ran 500 on a 50-foot steady techno crane. And we had that flying through the air and that actually had all the tracking systems on it to make so what happens is the tracking system knows where the camera is in space inside the virtual world. And that's what makes the background moves. And we ran that. We also ran Steadicam. And because of the size of the 500, by the time you build up all this tracking system on it, all the other bits and pieces you've got to do, they actually become quite unwieldy. So the 500, because of the size of it, worked really nicely. And on that setup, I didn't need to get metadata out of it because we weren't doing what they call set extensions. We were just shooting the actual scene as was. So we used the Simulate primes. And I found those for shooting inside a virtual world amazing because they've got that slightly softer, that more organic look to them. That when you light and you've got the backlight coming in, off, and particularly when we had bright lights on the screen, they flared around a little bit and they seemed to almost melt the person into the scene and make it a lot more believable. And that's something you're working with. The faster speed of the lens, because you do want a slightly shallower depth of field to separate. So speed of the lenses and all those primes are 1.3, 1.5s. They work very nicely to give that effect. But the Simiray really pulled it in really nicely and softened down that file. So, the 500, it's obviously also as well 4K monitoring is really important, because you can't monitor this stuff in 1080. Sometimes they need a 4K signal out. So there are other camera systems out there we haven't been able to, because you can't monitor in 4K. So that was a really important thing to us as well. And I know even when we were shooting in 4K, even not on an XR stage, and we've been monitoring in 1080, you've got the focus puller there, and they're using peaking, which is not always my favorite thing to focus on. And I've got back soft images because they're monitoring in 1080 for a 4K file, and they can't quite get it right. So, having the SDI 4K out is a really big thing as well. And the gen lock, and I think other cameras, we've had a little bit of issues with gen lock because you've got a gen lock into the screen. 500, I think that maybe comes from Canon's broadcast, the amount of work they've done in broadcast. The gen lock just works. Didn't even have to think about that, and the camera just gen locked straight in.
Perfect. And you've mentioned the C500, and we've got this new firmware.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So I think as you said, the C500 is not the latest camera. I mean, it's been out. I mean, I did the launch for it. It's 2 years old now. I think one of the things with Canon is they're always bringing, they're not coming out rapidly with firmware, but when they do bring out firmware, it makes a big difference. And it's nice to see it evolve inside the cinema. So they do listen to what the user's saying. So with the latest firmware on the 500, and I think on the 300 Mark III as well, we've got 120 frames per second face detection autofocus, which I mean, that's quite phenomenal, which wasn't there before. I mean, I think the 300 had face detection, the 500 didn't, but now that's all come in. I think, and just to watch those increments come along, and I mean, obviously I shoot with cinema primes a lot, but I still use things like face detection because you get the green box come up. I use focus assist on the 500 a lot, even when we're using cine primes. And it's quite interesting to watch. You watch a real traditional person who's grown up with film, they don't look at it, but I do turn it on. It's one of the first features I've turned on. And I think, on all the cinema EOS cameras, I think that, even the focus assist is a really good thing.
I mean, even if you're not planning on using it all the time, it's just a nice tool to have, right?
It's a really good tool because you've nailed focus. So and as I said a couple of times, we've had issues where you have been monitoring, and sometimes there's only an HD monitor on set. You don't always have the luxury. I mean, it's only probably the last year that 4K monitors have started to come from rental houses, maybe the last 2 years. Well, when the 4K first came out, you had HD all the time, so you couldn't monitor in 4K. So, that focus assist always gave you that little guarantee on the cine primes. And they've got such a shallow depth of field, and the full frame sensor, you need to have that. So to have that, but now to bring that in with autofocus, and I've seen stuff, I've seen some great examples, when people are doing circular tracks on interviews, and it doesn't matter how good a focus puller you are, you can see them drifting in and out. So to have face detection and start to get cameras moving, knowing that it's locked onto that face with autofocus, with a cinema, grade camera is quite phenomenal, I think.
You said you use a lot of primes and the Simiray primes. We've now got this new Flex Zoom.
Yeah, so I mean, that's really interesting. So I've always been Mr. Fixed lens, fixed focal length. I mean, I like pulling out, I've always joked, I've said, that's what your legs are for, you walk backwards and forwards, and I've liked the look of prime lenses. They have a certain look. So zooms I've always stayed off because I've always felt they've had a little bit of a broadcast look about them. But now they have the new Flex Zooms, and for me, I mean, not only do they cut with the primes that are out there, but they have a prime look about them. So when you set on that focal length, it literally looks like a prime. And I'm really impressed in how they perform. They're a nice size, they're not too small, not too big. They've got a nice T-stop to them as well.
Yeah, it's constant 2.4, which is really
constant,
lovely.
really fast to the length of the lens. And then on top of that, they've got the metadata coming out as well. So with a zoom lens in shooting in an XR stage, you need to know what the focal length is, so that's coming out, and the T-stop as well. So it's giving both all that information out via the metadata as well. So
it's really nice to see how, Canon, we know, take a holistic view of things, but it's nice to see that coming together in all the different parts, the cameras, the lenses, everything kind of working towards this new technology, the XR stage, and how it all fits together.
Well, I mean, up until then we'd been on, if you wanted a full frame zoom, you were sort of back to a stills lens, which obviously don't have the breathing, and so to have a full frame in a very compact, I remember the first sort of full frame zooms I had seen were beasts of a lens. So, this is a very nice compact. I mean, I'd be able to put that on my shoulder and use it if I wanted to.
So Brett, just thinking about some of your bigger shoots where you might involve like multi-camera stuff. Obviously Canon have got the PTZs and the XFs and the Cinema series. How do you fit those together in kind of a real world?
Well, I think that so in the new firmware, which obviously had the face tracking at 120 frames, there's also an XC protocol that they've brought out, and that allows all of those cameras they're working in a similar color space. So now the idea is that you can. Before you might have had almost like two separate crews. So you might have had a cinematic crew and then a run around sort of run and gun crew, a little bit more, with the XF cameras and the PTZs. But now all of that stuff should be able to cut together. So I think that's going to make a really interesting thing, because in theory, we should almost be able to make a cinematic, a whole look across, from a XF Handycam, PTZ, if we're inside the studio, to then, with the full cinema cameras. So I think that's a really interesting thing. So I think that opens up a lot more maybe to creative freedom, because I find it quite entertaining now that sometimes I see people take these cameras, and a classic example, you see the rigs that people build. You walk over to a camera, a rig, and you actually have to look for the camera. And I'm a firm believer that if the camera's made to that size, try and use it to that size. I remember when I first did the stuff with the C500 with the autofocus and the inbuilt stabilization, I didn't really believe the stabilization was going to be that good, and we used it on a Jaguar commercial, and I handheld it in the front of the car, and it was phenomenal. So suddenly I'm thinking, well, actually I can now use some of these other cameras in different ways. So I can probably take one of the XF series and use that, and suddenly handhold that and cut that into my cinema footage from the C500. So I think it opens up a lot more possibilities.
Do you find with Canon that quite often they bring things out and it takes you a moment to go, now I see where
you've got to have a realization. What you can sit back and think. We've got a really exciting project coming up that we're going to use an ME200 on, with a very low light camera, and that's something that I suddenly dawned on me. I went, well, maybe we can use it to do that. So yes, it takes you a while to realize you've got to think about how that stuff mixes together. So inside cars, I'm obviously shooting car commercial. Well, suddenly we put little tiny cameras in cars and cut that together with the big stuff, and it's not going to look like a GoPro, and it's going to all work together. And we know it's all inside the Canon color science. So and we know how good that color science is. So everything should and cut together. So it's going to open up a whole new world of possibilities, I think.
Perfect. Well, thank you for taking the time to chat to us, telling us about the XR Studio and all the firmware and all of that jazz. And good luck with your upcoming shoots.
Excellent.
And look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Yes, lovely. Thank you very much. Cool.